This is World War I as you've never seen it before. It seems unbelievable, but there are thousands of 3D photographs taken of the First World War, yet none of them have ever been shown on TV in their original format. Now we've recreated the original stereoscopic effect to bring some of these incredible images back to life, and they enable us to view the war from an entirely new perspective. We spent 4.5 years fighting the First World War and the best part of 100 arguing about it. There are so many myths and opinions and politics and propaganda surrounding it that we no longer know what we feel about it, or even how we should celebrate it. Was it a triumph or an unspeakable horror? Do we side with the poets or the politicians? We can't even agree how our children should be taught about it. It's been a cultural battlefield for every generation that followed it. Over the course of this series, I've been trying to answer the questions I have about the war, like who, if anyone, was responsible.
I think Germany deserves more than most of the blame because Germany was the one power that could have stopped it.
And I've looked at the weapons of war and the deadly innovations that brought the killing to the home front. Finally, I travelled to Passchendaele, where men fought and died in some of the worst conditions of the conflict.
In this valley, men drowned in the mud, they were blown to pieces by enemy artillery, machine guns cut them down. 500,000 men on both sides were killed or wounded.
12 months after Passchendaele, the whole sorry mess was over. This is the story of how the war was won. This is the Menin Gate, a memorial to the men who died defending the Belgian city of Ypres and whose bodies have never been found. They're remembered here every night in a ceremony that has become iconic. The Last Post. It is extraordinary, the number of people who are here. None of these people, of course, fought in the First World War or had parents who fought in the First World War. At least half wouldn't have had grandparents who fought in the war. And yet they come and they treat it with a kind of seriousness and a kind of gentleness that I find absolutely remarkable. And what I find doubly remarkable is that although, yes, there's been a service here virtually every day since 1928, now more and more people are coming. And not just here, it's the same at Gallipoli, it's the same as far as the Somme is concerned, and Mons, and a whole host of other battlefields. People are recognising what happened in the First World War in a way that probably the general population has never done before. There are 54,896 names on that wall. They belong to British and Commonwealth troops who fought and died here. Australians, Indians, South Africans, Canadians, a whole world at war. And people come from all over the world to pay their respects here. With the conflict now a century old, more and more of us are trying to understand this war and what our grandparents and great-grandparents experienced. At Ypres, they went through hell, but for very little gain. After 3 years of war, we were still fighting along the same stretch of France and Belgium. Sections of territory would change hands, but the men were still living and dying in trenches as they had been since 1914. Something had to give. The Allies' great hope was that their new partner in the war, America, could power them to victory. The problem was, they needed time to raise and train a massive army. Recruitment was driven by provocative propaganda posters. And the Americans didn't mess about here, did they? This one recalls the 128 Americans killed when a U-boat sank the Lusitania. America's entry also created a new market for 3D stereographic pictures, and companies were soon taking photographs of American troops in training. Like this, a practice drill to get them used to going over the top. Or this fearsome barbed wire obstacle, meant to mimic the kind of things they'd face in France. On the back of this one, it says, "In no field did the American soldier show himself more proficient than in shooting, as they make the world safer for democracy." Even a century ago, sharp-shooting, gun-toting Americans were guarding democracy. Brilliant. But just as America was on the point of joining the war, another country was slipping out. This photo shows a small section of the once mighty Russian army. Its caption reads, "A bristling forest of bayonets." Well, by 1918, those bayonets were no longer pointing at Germany. Revolution forced the Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate in February 1917. 10 months later, the new Bolshevik government decided it had had enough of war and it sued for peace. It provided Germany with a huge boost. They now had extra men to strengthen the line. This former hotel in the Belgian town of Spa became the temporary headquarters for the German army during the war. In 1918, the German generals met here to decide what to do in the wake of the Russian surrender, because that had freed up an enormous number of German troops who could be redeployed to the Western Front. In fact, they now had 1.5 times as many troops as the Allies had. But with the Americans about to join in the fray, that advantage wouldn't last long. So the generals decided to throw everything they had into one last make-or-break attack. And this man, German commander Erich Ludendorff, knew he had to make the most of this opportunity.
From 1916 onwards, Germany was largely ruled by the generals. The Kaiser was still nominally running Germany, but actually it was Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the great generals, who were actually in charge. And Ludendorff was really effectively a sort of military dictator with Hindenburg as front man. And Ludendorff, after the Russians collapsed, he saw this terrific sudden window of opportunity.
Here is Ludendorff, and with him the Kaiser and then Hindenburg. In theory, the king was in charge. Indeed, the new offensive was christened the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's battle. But in reality, he had very little to do with the war. The army was calling all the shots. The attack, which the Allies would call the Spring Offensive, was targeted at a section of Allied territory near Cambrai, where the defences were weaker than in other parts of the line. The plan involved 74 German divisions, over 600 guns and more than 300 aircraft.
And everything they've got goes into it. So it's a series of attacks, mainly on the join between the British and the French. If they can do that, they think, the French will pull back to protect Paris and the British will head for the Channel ports.
The first part of the offensive was codenamed Operation Michael. Under the cover of heavy artillery bombardments, stormtroopers, the youngest, fittest, best-equipped soldiers in the German army, broke through the British lines. Some were armed with flamethrowers to clear a path. The aim was to surprise the Allies with their speed and hit them so hard they'd be overwhelmed. It worked. To find out how the British troops responded to the attack, I've come to the Imperial War Museum to meet archivist Anthony Richards, who can show me diaries written on that dreadful day. I woke at 5 a.m. to hear a terrific barrage starting by our guns, questions from each bunk in very drowsy voices. Is the Boche attacking? Is it just a preventative barrage by us as a result of information received? Is it a case of a wind-up? Who was the guy?
It was a Major Hardwick, who was a medical officer. He was actually attached to the 59th Field Ambulance, but he was there on the Western Front at the time of the German Spring Offensive. So he says, so up we got at once. I had a look out of the hut to see if the flashes could be seen easily. And by gum, there was a very thick white fog on, and it was impossible to see more than 100 yards away. So if the Boche is attacking, then he has got the very devil's own luck, as there has been no mist such as this for weeks.
The barrage he described was the largest ever targeted at the British. In 5 hours, the German guns fired 3.5 million shells. The stalemate of the last 3 years was shattered, as the British lines were swamped by superior German forces. The war had entered a new dynamic phase, and the country leading the charge was Germany. In March 1918, Germany launched Operation Michael, the first stage in their huge spring offensive. And they smashed through the British trenches with a surprise attack that turned the war on its head. On the first day of the operation, German stormtroopers penetrated deep into British positions, killing nearly 20,000 men and wounding another 35,000. Winston Churchill, then the British Minister for Munitions, was visiting troops at Noorlu, just 15 miles from where the opening barrage began. He wrote, "There rose in less than 1 minute the most tremendous cannonade I shall ever hear. The enormous explosions of the shells upon our trenches seemed almost to touch each other. The weight and intensity of the bombardment surpassed anything which anyone had ever known before." By the end of the first day, the Germans had captured 100 square miles of territory. It was the biggest territorial gain either side had made since the opening weeks of World War I.
In the early days of Operation Michael, it did achieve spectacular results. It punched a huge hole in the British line. It frightened the life out of the Allies.
But after 5 days of heavy fighting, the Allies' resistance began to stiffen. Men and equipment from all along the line were brought in to reinforce their defences. As the Allies rallied to the cause, Germany found its men were lacking the stamina and resources to sustain their attack.
The great German command and control had started to break down because the soldiers had been told, one more push and the British are finished. British Army's starving, they were told. And then they overran British ration depots. And they find luxuries that they haven't seen in 3 years. So what's all this about the British Army starving? They overrun rum stocks. And that causes all sorts of problems. And it's the first time, really, in German military history, where you find letters from German officers saying, I never thought I would see this. My troops are drunk. They will not obey me.
The spectacular advance created a problem with supplies. They struggled to get what little they had to the troops leading the charge. It's always easier to feed soldiers defending a position, like these men in a 3D photograph at a French field kitchen enjoying a bowl of soup. The British rations were some of the best on the Western Front, so it's easy to see how sights like this could make the German forces question the direction of the war. It wasn't just food they were short of either.
The basic problem all the way through the First World War was that defenders could reinforce the threatened bits much more quickly than attackers could push on through. And the German offensive in March 1918, after giving everybody the fright of their lives for a few days, it ran out of steam. And that was really Ludendorff's last throw. From that moment on, if Ludendorff had been smart, he would have said, let's make peace quick.
But he didn't. Anxious to press home the German advantage, he prepared his weary troops to launch a second major offensive. now targeting the British lines of communication, which were vulnerable to attack. The Germans were now desperate to find a weak spot, and they realised that the main rail line between Arras and the coastal ports was now painfully exposed. If they could capture that, then they could starve the British of supplies. So the High Command came up with a new plan. Operation Georgette was another do-or-die attempt to try and end the war in Germany's favour. Launched in Flanders, the line of the advance stretched from the River Lys to the north of Ypres. The aim was simple: to smash the Allied supply and communication lines. The attack began on the 7th of April 1918. They smashed through the strung-out Allied defences, and for one dreadful moment, it looked like the lines would break. Fearing the Germans would be at the ports within a week, Douglas Haig, the British commander, knew that his forces were facing a desperate situation. So on the 11th of April 1918, he issued a defiant rallying cry. There is no course open to us but to fight it out. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs against the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight on to the end.
He said it because there's this last throw of the Germans, everything they'd got into this offensive, the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's offensive in 1918. And the lines are pulling back, pulling back, pulling back. And Haig knows that if they pull back much further, the piece of elastic will break. And that's when he says, this is backs to the wall. We stand and fight. That actually works with the British. The British are a grumpy nation, they're a stubborn nation, they're a pretty bolshy nation. And when you say to them, backs to the wall, this is it, they will actually react to that. I mean, we're not that good on offensives. We're bloody good when we have to defend, because we're stubborn buggers.
Is that what it took to win the war? Stubbornness? American historian Gerard de Groot agrees. So you think this notion of British stoicism is real? It's not just some kind of cliche that we invented to pat ourselves on the back?
No, I do think so. Yeah, I think, you know, it's the bulldog mentality. There's something almost concrete about the British determination. We do have our backs against the wall. You know, this is where we're at our best.
Yes, at least it means there's a wall. There's something solid there, even if it's only our own psyches.
Indeed, yes. You know, that the wall is British culture, is British history. We're up against it, but that wall is a pretty solid wall.
This British bulldog spirit was also stirring beyond the trenches. Our home front rallied together. Men and women flocked to work the Easter weekend to bump up supplies. Despite the bad news, thousands of shells, bullets, guns and artillery, tanks and aircraft rolled off the production line and made their way to France. The British had refused to break.
What actually happens is that the piece of elastic stretches and stretches and stretches and stretches, but never actually breaks. And the Germans, having shot their bolt, they haven't got another bolt.
Germany's biggest problem had been caused by these men and thousands like them. These were the pride of the British Royal Navy, who'd spent the war successfully blockading the German ports and starving the country of supplies.
Because of the Royal Naval blockade, they cannot import rubber. So their vehicles are running on steel rims, and you can't do that for very long. They'd run out of everything. They'd run out of ammunition.
They'd overstretch their lines?
They'd overstretch their lines. So they run out of materiel. They also actually run out of morale.
The relentless blockade had put the Germans on the brink of starvation. As well as the lack of rations on the front line, there were also shortages and food riots at home. The nation was losing its will to win. One letter at the time to a German soldier from his parents spells this out. The only way for this to end is for Germany to be defeated. The English will hang on forever. All I know is it can't go on forever. We can't stick it for another winter. The American journalist George Schreiner spent the war reporting from the German home front. He decided to cover the food queues and shortages that were paralysing Berlin. He wrote, "Among 300 applicants for food, there was no one who had had enough to eat for weeks. In the case of the younger women and children, the skin was drawn hard to the bones and was bloodless. Eyes had fallen deeper into the sockets. From the lips, all colour was gone. All signs that the nervous vigour of the body was departing." Before the war, Berlin was seen as a beacon of enlightenment, a city of culture and music and philosophy. But by 1918, things were very different. This macabre 2D photograph reveals people who, driven by hunger, have butchered a horse in the street after the animal was shot during a riot. Starving at home, exhausted on the battlefield, Germany's military gamble had failed. The balance of power had swung back to the Allies. Now they had the initiative, and they'd soon be fighting with a new kind of battle plan. It would bring together all the hard lessons learned so far and was launched under the supervision of an Australian military genius. In spring 1918, Germany threw everything it had into a last-ditch attempt to overwhelm their enemy. This stereo photo dramatically captures the German attack, which pushed the British forces to the brink of defeat before they ran out of resources and ground to a halt. As Germany faltered, the momentum switched to the Allies, who had the technology, the supplies and the manpower to take up the fight. The best illustration of this change of fortunes was in the skies above the Western Front. At the start of the war, the average life expectancy of an Allied flyer was just 6 weeks. For a long time, our aircraft were easy meat for the better-equipped German Air Force. The top gun of his day was this man, the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. He was responsible for shooting down 80 Allied pilots in just 18 months. This 3D photograph is an astonishing document of the kind of carnage that Germany created in the sky above the Western Front. But by spring 1918, the Allies had got their act together. Dodge Bailey is a pilot who flies World War I aircraft at the Shuttleworth Collection in Bedfordshire. What is this plane, Dodge?
It's actually a Bristol fighter, Bristol F2B, and this represents really the epitome of First World War aircraft design. We've got an aeroplane that's got 260 horsepower, and it's a wooden structure, but the covering is actually Irish linen and then doped, and it's quite strong.
Is it still essentially like one of the very early aeroplanes, or is it much closer to the kind of thing that we fly in today?
It looks like an earlier aeroplane, but in terms of how it handles, its stability and its controllability are moving towards a modern aeroplane. So it's a predictable aeroplane to fly.
So you think I should be all right?
You'll be fine.
Yeah. I love that smile. You'll be fine. Yeah. It might handle like a modern plane, but flying one of these in combat was a real test of endurance. These French soldiers waving off an Allied fighter are definitely safer on the ground. Dodge wants to show me just how tough this plane is and how difficult a job the pilots had, which means taking to the skies in a 100-year-old aircraft. It's so incredibly exhilarating. On the sides, of course, you can just see everywhere. But in front of you, you can't see anything coming towards you. You just had to keep moving around all the time, twisting, turning, just to make sure something wasn't coming at you. I imagine that the guys who were flying these would have been absolutely wiped out. They have to be really fit, I think. By 1918, we had around 4,000 elite combat planes. And not only were our planes better, so too were the men flying them. Crucially, with American, Canadian, French and Australian pilots taking to the skies, we were now outnumbering the enemy. If one event symbolises the end of German domination in the air, it was the death of von Richthofen. In April 1918, his killing streak came to an end when he was shot down by ground troops with machine guns. These are French, but a similar system manned by Australians probably did the deed. The Baron was buried by the Allies with full military honours. If one Australian had brought down the Baron, another was about to revolutionise the war on the ground. One of the first men to understand and orchestrate a modern battle was an Australian general, and his tactical genius is celebrated here at the Australian Memorial Park. His name was John Monash. Monash had a voracious appetite for new ideas and studied the way tactics were evolving on the front. His ambition was to adopt a coordinated approach to the problems of trench warfare. On the 1st of July 1918, he had the chance to put his ideas into practice at Le Hamel in France. To find out about this battle, I'm meeting Australian historian Matt McLachlan.
This was where years of men marching into machine guns and artillery fire was effectively abandoned, and this new concept where men could be supported by tanks and aircraft and artillery really came into effect.
Why, what was it that he did?
Basically, his concept was that infantry were not supposed to advance alone. He thought that was a big mistake that had happened previously in the war. This time, he said, let's get tanks there with them to take out machine gun posts. Let's get aircraft to come over and spot for them and to drop them supplies. He came up with this great innovation, which was a carrier tank. And this tank could carry up supplies and ammunition to the men and do the work of 1,200 soldiers. So great innovation.
It sounds so obvious to us, doesn't it? After years of this mass slaughter of men charging across battlefields, suddenly saying, well, actually, that's not the most important thing. We need support and we need technology.
You're absolutely right. And the reason it's so obvious today is this is still how we fight wars. Monash was really a great innovator. He was an engineer, he was a great thinker, and he was a great collector of information. And would read every report about every battle and he'd bring together the best bits. But he was looking for an opportunity to put it all together, and he did it here. He did it in this valley.
Monash's troops attacked under the cover of darkness, surprising the German forces. The Allies' ability to target their big guns had now improved to such an extent that they could hit their targets earlier and with greater accuracy, giving the enemy less time to react. They could also provide what was known as a creeping barrage, where they shelled just in front of their own advancing troops to stop the Germans firing at the Allied soldiers moving towards them. These tactics would prove invaluable as the Allies prepared to take the hill. So he started off down there. Where was he going?
They came straight up this hill. We're standing on the high ground now where the German positions were. You can get an idea of what a formidable position this is. I mean, just look at the view out here the Germans had. Imagine the Allies slogging their way up through that valley, even with the support of the tanks.
This picture of Allied tanks, taken from a French collection of 3D photographs, gives us an idea of what the Germans were up against. At Le Hamel, the tanks were painted with diagrams relating to the battalions that would support them. That way, the infantry knew which tank to follow in the heat of battle. It wasn't the only smart idea employed here. Monash used little tricks, though, didn't he, in order to fool the Germans?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the stories I love about this attack is that Monash, every night for about a week before the attack, they'd fire smoke shells and mix in gas with them. And the Germans got conditioned to this idea that if they ever saw smoke, there was going to be gas involved as well. On the night of the attack, they fired the smoke shells but didn't include the gas. And what happened was the Germans put on their gas mask like they had every night. And when the Australians and the Americans got up here, they found it much easier to fight against the Germans wearing these cumbersome gas masks.
This understanding had been evolving for some time. The Allies had had success in 1917 at Cambrai and Messines through better coordination of technology and tactics. Now, everything was coming together at the right time. Le Hamel introduced a lot of new elements to the battlefield, but one would be more important than all the others. it saw American units linking up with the Allies and taking to the battlefield. This is what Germany had been terrified of. Just how big a boost they provided can be seen in this 3D picture. It's of a captured German ship, the Fatherland. The Americans had seized it, rechristened it the Leviathan, and turned it into a troop transporter. So this massive ship is full of 14,000 fresh soldiers, all heading to France. For the Allies, it was a sight for sore eyes. For Germany, it was the beginning of the end.
Most Germans with half a brain realized when the Americans came into the war that it was going to be very, very difficult to defeat this extraordinary combination, even after the Russians had been seen off. That even after that, if the Americans had a chance to bring their full weight to bear, it was pretty obvious that the Germans hadn't got much chance.
The Allies were now ready to press home their advantage. On the 8th of August 1918, they began their fight back at the French city of Amiens. They wanted this area to be the battleground because it was flat, dry and hard. Perfect for an attack that would involve 350 tanks. The tanks would lead the charge at Amiens, the first battle in what became known as the 100 Days Offensive. And showing once again they'd learned the lessons of the past, the key to this attack would be the element of surprise. They brought the metal monsters into position under cover of darkness and flew planes overhead to muffle out the noise. On the eve of the battle, the Allies felt confident of success. But even the most optimistic commander couldn't have foreseen what would happen next. For 4 years, the conflict had been largely dominated by a grinding war of attrition and stalemate along the trenches of the Western Front. By summer 1918, that had changed completely. On August the 8th, the Allies began a series of attacks around the French city of Amiens, and the results were incredible. Part of the attack was launched at Le Hamel, and from here you get a clear picture of the shift in momentum.
If you look just up on the ridgeline, you can see a spire right there.
Just next to that little wood?
That's right. On the 8th of August 1918, the advance, the 100 days advance that ended the war, began from these trenches. In one day, they advanced from this trench to that spire. That's almost 15 kilometres away.
That's incredible given what had preceded it, isn't it?
Exactly. We think about the First World War, stalemate, mud, trenches. In one day, they advanced from this point 15 kilometres to that far ridgeline. It was breathtaking. The Germans called it Die Schwarze Tag, the Black Day. This was the day the Germans lost the war.
It wasn't just the speed of the Allies and the amount of territory they seized that shocked the German High Command. What was more disturbing was the reaction of their own soldiers. Here at his headquarters at Spa, the German commander Ludendorff called this the Black Day of the German army, not because of men or ground lost, but because it exposed the state of the army's morale. This once great fighting force had capitulated all down the line. Some German officers had even been abused by their own men when they were trying to rally the troops. They'd been sworn at and told to stop prolonging the war. The men on the ground knew the game was up and that victory was slipping from their grasp. But their commanders weren't ready to give in yet.
It was this old thing. Everybody kept saying to each other till 1918, how do we get out of this without a victory? Because the German people have been told all the way since 1914, we are going to produce huge rewards to compensate for this huge loss of life. Well, by 1918, where are these rewards? And one of the extraordinary things that had a huge effect on delaying the peace was that the German army found it very difficult to contemplate any end whereby they had to come home and say to the German people, we've lost.
The stunning success at Amiens was soon followed by a campaign of lightning-fast attacks targeted where the German line was weakest. the city of Albert was recaptured. On the 29th of August, Noyon was taken by the French, followed by Arras and Bapaume, until finally the Germans were pushed back to the Hindenburg Line. This is a 3D aerial photograph of a section of the line, and it shows just how deep and entrenched those positions were. The guns were protected by concrete. The Germans believed it was impregnable. They were wrong. The Allies began attacking sections of the line in September. They broke through in 9 days, capturing 380 heavy guns and 36,000 prisoners. Not that they gave up without a fight. This stereo photograph shows the moment an advancing Tommy trips over a booby trap and is blown back by the blast. In 3D, you feel you're just behind the bayonets as this soldier surrenders, although chances are it was probably mocked up for the cameras. There's nothing fake about this surrender picture, though. This is a line of 1,900 German prisoners captured by the Americans. The writing was on the wall for Germany. By the end of September, the Hindenburg Line had been breached and the German army was in full retreat. In Berlin, there was talk of revolution, while the military squabbled with the government about what to do next. The final straw came when the German Navy refused to fight. After that, the Kaiser knew the game was up. The generals he'd once admired and surrounded himself with were now persuading him to abdicate. This Belgian chateau had been given to the Kaiser to use when he visited the commanders. This is also the place where he signed the documents that put an end to his dynasty, and where he spent his last days as a monarch before his exile began in neutral Holland. The Kaiser, who had gone to war wanting an empire, had now lost his kingdom. So how did he react to exile? I asked his biographer, Katrina Clay.
He was a broken man, actually, completely broken.
But did he blame himself? Did he have any regrets?
No. He blamed everyone else. He never blamed himself. And he always felt he hadn't been appreciated. But of course, everyone else blamed him. And neither one of those versions is entirely true.
With the Kaiser gone, the military went ahead and arranged an armistice for the 11th of November, although it was a surrender in all but name. The official end to the hostilities was set for 11 o'clock. Every soldier knew it was coming, but it had little effect on the battlefield. There, pointless slaughter was still the order of the day. This is the grave of Private George Edwin Ellison, aged 40, born in Leeds. He joined up a long time before the war, but then he left to get married and become a miner, and when the war broke out, he was recalled to uniform and fought at the First Battle of Ypres. He survived the first gas attack, he saw the first tanks roll out. He was there at Loos, at Cambrai, at Armentières, and survived them all. Until on the 11th of November 1918, at 9:30 a.m., just 90 minutes shy of the ceasefire, he was shot by a sniper. In all, 863 Empire soldiers were killed on the morning of the armistice. What an utter waste of life. Not that the crowds who were celebrating across the world knew anything about those deaths. This is a photograph of the Victory Parade in London. The scene was repeated all over the world. This was obviously a moment for celebration. But 100 years on, we don't seem so sure about this war anymore.
We argue about most things in history, but especially about the First World War, because for Britain, it was the worst military experience. We lost nearly twice as many people as we did in the Second World War, and the poets have made a huge contribution. I think we will argue till the end of time about whether the war was worth fighting, and I don't think the answer is easy. But the idea we could have just left the Germans to take over the continent, I, for one, find it very hard to go along with that. I think it's almost impossible with any war to say that it was worth millions of dead. The truth is that it's very difficult to paint it in black and white, that the morality is very confused.
Have we got the war right in the way that we talk about it?
No, I don't think we have. I think it's seen as unnecessary, as futile, as managed by idiots, that the army took a whole generation of this nation and of the empire and threw them away. I don't think that's right, and I think historical opinion is shifting, and I think if one goes back to primary sources and you look at the evidence, that is not the case. But shifting public opinion is very, very difficult. People believe it was unnecessary, it was futile, and we lost a generation. I would say no, no, no to that, but that's what people believe. I mean, people see it, even today, it's something emotional. It's not emotional, it's part of our history. This is what happened, this is what we did, we actually did it pretty well.
I'm not so sure. I know it's history. I'm sorry, I do get emotional about it. How could you not be when you see something like this? This is about as disturbing an image as we've found while making this programme. And like all of the images from this war, it's doubly shocking because we feel connected to this generation. We know who they are. Throughout this series, we've used original 3D photographs to try and get a tangible sense of some of the people who were involved in the First World War. But, of course, there are other ways of making an emotional link with people. For instance, look at some of these little messages that have been written on the little wooden crosses by tourists. Charles Parker, thank you. You deserve your life back. I found you. R.I.P. Uncle, God bless you. From your granddaughter, thank you for sacrificing your life for me. I love you. To us, the world before the First War seems a lost age of innocence, tempered only slightly by the fact that it saw the beginnings of so many of today's technologies. But the war itself turned the whole world upside down, and when it was finished, that age of innocence was dead, and all we had left was the future. World War I helped make us who we are. It gave birth to our world, the modern world. Maybe that's why we can't walk away from it.